Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're gonna kick things off, and we're gonna get started. Get your blood going with another question. So you might check. I think the Poll Everywhere might log you out if it's been more than a half an hour. So you may have to text the number. No? You're saying no.
We tried it. It's fine.
Okay, we tried it and it's fine. So here, you know how to do this by now. Question is, name one. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. If get out your smartphone, get your messaging app out, and by the way, I should tell you that you know, if your plan charges for text, it may charge you. So just send your bill to Patrick, and he will reimburse you for your charges. So text to the address 22333, and then text the word TOXICS as the message. That will get you into the poll. You'll get a little message that says, you're in the poll. And then after you've gotten that, just in the subject matter, you don't have to, right? Just the message itself, please answer the question, name one company that you believe is making efforts to reduce or eliminate toxics. And if your company's got more than one word, if you want to keep them together, just string it, make it one word. Don't put a space in and they'll stay together, okay? Nice. Oh, I didn't vote.
You keep pressing send.
Yeah. Let's see what we got. Well, I'm sure feeling good that Beauty Counter is getting so big because we have somebody from Beauty Counter here. I sent it 8 times. No, I didn't really. Very good. I mean, in a way, that's heartening, isn't it, to see so many companies that are up there? And it kind of leads us into our first session for this afternoon, businesses and tools to reduce exposures. And what we've got in store for you are 2 folks who have been kind of engaged in this from the very, very start of the move towards elimination of toxics at the company level, right? So our first speaker is a dear friend, Ann Blake, who I've known for quite some time. I don't want to, she has a line that she'll share with you about her background, but Ann is an independent consultant who works with both companies and NGOs and governments to assist them in making chemical assessment decisions. She's also a member of the Green Ribbon Science Panel in California, which is an advisory group that helps the Department of Toxic Substances Control implement their, really very revolutionary consumer products regulation. So Ann's going to kick us off with a discussion of safer chemicals and materials, making the business case for that. Ann?
Thank you, Tim, and thank you also for the coveted position of being the first after lunch. It's the only one worse than that is stepping between you and cocktails at the end of the day. So I find it interesting that I'm up here talking about business because I spent 10 years as a researcher, another 10 years as a regulator, and then the last 15 years as a consultant. I thought I'd get out of the letter R. But it has been interesting. I think of myself as a scientist first and a scientist with an advocate's heart. And I tried to find a non-cheesy title for this. I certainly don't want to mislead you and say that that all business is universally shifting to safer alternatives because it's the right thing to do. A very small minority are, including my friends here at Beauty Counter up front. But I also wanted to give you an overview of why businesses are doing this and the kinds of things that they are doing. And I'm going to cover a lot of territory in 10 minutes because Tim has, not that I need any encouragement to talk fast, but I will try to cover that and still be comprehensible. And the other thing, so I'm going to start first with drivers. Why are businesses moving to to safer alternatives. And then because I'm a biologist, I think of things as an ecosystem. And I think about all the different ways that you can push on an ecosystem to make it shift. And we have tried many of those in the last couple of decades, and some work better than others. And the classic answer when someone says, how do we get systems change, is it depends, because we are, of course, scientists. And we can never give our nice, clear answer, right? I'm also going to talk a little bit about green chemistry and alternatives assessment very, very quickly. All of these topics I've created a curriculum, a 10-week curriculum on alternatives assessment. So if you want to spend more time with that, I can talk your ear off about it. And then a little bit about market barriers and incentives and some of the challenges of the practice of alternatives assessment. Tim started talking about going beyond regulation, and I would agree with him. I started as a regulator, and I feel like it needs to be there as a floor for the worst of the worst businesses, but it is kind of what I would consider to be a lagging indicator, right? It's not often a proactive thing to move businesses forward. Is there a clicker, or am I? Ha, there's my elbow on the clicker, okay. So let's start with some of the drivers. Obviously, that was not the thing I was supposed to do. Am I going the wrong way? Aha. Turn the clicker in the correct format. All right, so let's start with some of the key drivers. I should start also by saying that these are the drivers that a lot of people talk about, supply chain pulls, increased consumer awareness, increasing access to information on hazards. A lot of this has been touched on already. And investors, but behind this is a lot of the NGO activists in this room. NGO pressure is key in all of these places. It is rarely discussed and acknowledged publicly, and that's with very rare exceptions. I think very recently I heard the apparel industry acknowledge that the Greenpeace report on contaminants in the environment actually brought them all to the table for the first time. But that's something that overarches all of this, and you'll be hearing more about that from my colleagues later this afternoon. So what are some of the drivers that are pushing businesses towards safer alternatives? Much of it has been from the end of the supply chain. Retailers, again, in many cases under NGO pressure. OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, so that's the name brand on your car or your computer, pushing back up the supply chain and saying, what's in this component you're selling me? And as Tim mentioned this morning, the answer might be A, I don't know, or B, if I know, I wouldn't tell you. So that continues to be a challenge of getting information out of the supply chain. Tim outlined, what could happen within a company, but once that company starts pushing to find out the products that are coming in for them, they also have challenges about finding out what those chemistries are that are coming into their products. Increased consumer demand. We've heard enough about that this morning, so I won't go into more in demand about that. But I will say that is a huge market, particularly now we're seeing young mothers are a huge purchasing segment. I think that sort of visceral sense of, I've just given birth to this baby that's come out of me, so anything that comes into my body or my baby's body, I certainly want to be sure is non-toxic. And they have an enormous amount of purchasing power and a lot of lobbying power. So you'd have to be an idiot in business if you're not looking at that market. And then I would probably highlight here investors as the latest emerging piece that has been somewhat new. As with climate, where we start to see the insurance and reinsurance industries saying, this is too costly. We're starting to see investors saying, look, if you're a business that's dependent, let's say dyes and colorants, as an area with a lot of toxic chemistry, if you're in a business that's dependent on a chemical that's toxic and is likely to be regulated, you're not a good long-term investment. And again, once again, NGOs are very key in bringing some of that information together. All right, so there are multiple system leverage points. And basically, as I look back at the landscape of the last 20 years or so, when I start to see that businesses are now responding less to external levers and just more to internal levers, these are the things that have helped that shift happen. And these are still key. I mean, like I said, this is only a very small section of business that is actually moving towards safer alternatives in a more or less voluntary way. Institutional purchasing is a huge one. This is taking cities, counties, large health organizations. It's very powerful when Kaiser Permanente says, I'm not going to buy furniture with flame retardants in it anymore because I think it's toxic, and I'm a health organization. It's a huge optics issue there if you're selling flame retardant furniture. Third-party certifications have come in those years as well. And so the three big chunks I'm talking about externally are institutional purchasing, so large purchasers, individual consumers, and workers. We've built tools to help workers translate the information that they get, because they are obligated to get, even though OSHA is subpar at best. There is still requirements for information about chemicals in workplaces, but that's a hard thing for our workers to sift through. So we built a tool that allows them to do that more efficiently, and also to lobby for safer alternatives as they're available. So those are all those, basically all of those together are what I'm thinking of as we've been aggregating and amplifying demand on the demand side of the economic argument. Wow, 5 minutes and barely started. Thank you, Patrick. So Tim wanted me to talk also about emerging business models that have come out in response to some of these external pressures. And one of them is the B Corporation. How many of you are familiar with the B or benefit corporation? Oh, hey. Okay, well, you have to because you are one. It's a bias sample, that's true. Okay, so I will, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, a B Corporation is a model that has emerged in the last 10 years. A B Corporation writes into its corporate charter that it is responsive to all stakeholders, not just shareholders, so it allows them a longer-term planning vision. And a B Corporation solves a social or environmental problem as part of its business model. You'll see some companies up there that you also saw in the word cloud, 7th Gen, Etsy, Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's. Those are huge method, some of the founding B Corps. And you become a B Corp by changing we had to change the laws at the corporate level, at the state level, corporate laws. I didn't live and learn. Tim probably could have told me this, but corporate law is all at the state level. And then you take an impact assessment, and I've put my own companies up here. I should have put yours up, Nicole, because you probably write better than mine. So I'm a sole proprietor, so this is a fairly easy thing for me to do. So we look at impacts on government, on environment, workers, customers, community, and governance models. And in my case, because I am the sole worker, although I work with workers in other industries and try to reduce toxics exposure, I'm not being evaluated on that. But the assumption is that every business is going to be strong in one of these areas, and then there are sort of reach goals, stretch goals within each of the assessment areas for companies. Now a very quick tour through sector, some of the positive things that are happening in business. Managing chemicals in the supply chain, measuring impacts, chemical impacts, and then starting to shift to finding solutions to particularly heinous industrial chemical problems across the sector. Or within, they're starting to see that, you don't want to have your market differentiation be that you are a slightly less or slightly more toxic product on the market than other folks in your field, because all apparel, for example, are being made from the same chemicals and with the same supply chain. There are some efforts at the retailer level in apparel and footwear, to a lesser extent in electronics, the auto industry, so a whole lot of large, complex consumer products. There are sector-based efforts to try to get a handle on the chemistry and also reduce the worst of the worst. Probably the thing that I want to highlight is that there is an emerging, very small, but emerging effort to partner with academic institutions, particularly around green chemistry and safer alternatives, and also biomimicry, looking to nature to solve, how does nature solve the problems that we have tried to solve with industrial chemistry, with all its downstream effects that we've been talking about this morning. So there are two of particular interest. I've just joined the board of one, full disclosure. UC Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry has run for the last 4 years a class called Greener Solutions, which is a multidisciplinary graduate level class that partners with industry on a very specific chemical question. One of the first ones they did was permanent press from Levi's, which has traditionally been formaldehyde. Suggested, so at the end of the semester, students do a whole survey of potential solutions, and the company can leave with potential solutions that they can then take into the lab. And Levi's, in fact, has taken one of these solutions, non-formaldehyde solutions, in the lab. Formaldehyde, in case anybody's wondering, cast number 50000. Human carcinogen, known human carcinogen used in 52 million metric tons a year. And the two largest uses are building materials and textiles, so this is key. Other things they've done recently, Patagonia has worked with them on a non-toxic mosquito repellent for outdoor clothing. bio-based colorants for biodegradable plastics, method in 7th generation, safer preservatives for personal care products and cleaning products. I'm going to skip some of these other things, but another emerging area that you might be interested in is GC3. Green Chemistry and Commerce Council has just created a, we need help with the name here. It's the Green Chemistry and Bio-Based Innovation Startup Network. Try to say that all in one breath. It's a good mantra. And this is right now is a couple of dozen small startups, including folks that haven't finished their chemistry PhDs yet and are creating biodegradable plastics from lignin waste, from methane and various other places, and just really trying to solve problems, immediate problems that they see. The network is trying to match them up with large companies. So a couple of months ago, we had reverse pitches from large companies saying what problems they have in their sector, chemical problems they have in their sector, to try to match. What we're missing right now is a green marketplace, matching the innovation from green chemistry to a problem that's actually out in the marketplace. There's no way I'm going to cover the rest of this in a minute. So we've talked about, so the big shift here is first getting a handle on chemicals in your supply chain, and then trying to decide what to do about that. Either designing something, green chemistry, Bernie was going to put some green chemistry slides up, but he didn't get a chance to, so green chemistry is the idea of designing molecules from the beginning to be benign by design. That's another whole, there are many curricula available on green chemistry, so I won't go through that in any detail. And then how do you go about either designing or selecting a safer alternative, and that's the process. So really implementing green chemistry is implementing safer alternatives. The only thing I wanted to point out here is a safer alternative is one that is less hazardous to humans and the environment than the existing chemical process. But let's not limit ourselves to chemistry. Let's think about also a different material or designing a process completely differently. So for example, instead of putting BPS, instead of BPA in a thermal receipt, or as another company has done, adding vitamin C and trying to tell you that it's actually good for you to be rubbing your hands on a thermal receipt. Anybody else want to tell me how, is that actually, like a dermal exposure to vitamin C, is that actually helpful? Anyway, another topic entirely. Design it in such a way, I'm stealing this example from Tim, design it so that we don't use thermal receipts at all, but instead use the little, the little square on your cell phone or whatever. And we're sort of moving to that. That wasn't an intentional shift, but that solves the problem in a different way. So thinking in a different way, not just chemistry, maybe a different material, but also maybe just serving that function in a way that's that doesn't involve chemistry. Chemical-free, as it were. Do you want me to keep going on the alternatives assessment piece?
No. Here, I'll make you a promise.
Yes.
You'll get asked about the alternative.
Okay. So I will throw this up here and we'll talk about it in a bit. Tim had asked me to talk about alternatives assessment. This is the process by which one chooses a safer alternative, and this means, assessing trade-offs at a broad level. The mistakes that we've made that we see in the environment are mistakes of decision-making mistakes, basically. We've seen shifts like you eliminate CFCs, you get a population of workers that are exposed to N-hexane as a propellant, and we heard about the charms of N-hexane this morning. So in auto repair, and you don't find out until you see the exposure in the workers, right, the peripheral neuropathy, that you've had this regrettable substitution. So we see shifts from one health endpoint to another health endpoint, from carcinogens to reproductive toxicant, from one environmental medium to another, and very often from an environmental medium onto workers. So that's how I ended up in this world. So this process of alternatives assessment, which Tim promises we'll talk about, we will go through in more detail. We're trying to solve the problem of not making those mistakes. How do we avoid those mistakes in the future? I will say that this adapted version of the alternatives assessment frame is from a report that Catherine Alcantara and I worked with NRDC and Sally Edwards at UMass Lowell on. It should be out in the next week or two. Yes, Catherine, don't you think? And it's introducing how do we solve some of the problems of particularly vulnerable populations, and how do we make sure that alternatives assessment takes those into account. We'll talk about alternatives assessment more, and decision making. Really, I can't put up our slides, Tim? Okay. So the other thing you have to do is create models, and this is some of the work I've done with Tim Mulloy here and some other folks at UCLA. How do you take all these things that you really are hard to trade off? How do you trade off carcinogens with performance and cost, environmental impact? How do you take all those heterogeneous inputs, as it were, and come up with a solution, and how do you drive those decisions? So we worked on modeling and ways of making that easier to see. So this is in the case of garment cleaning. And then finally, and then I promise I'll shut up. So we now are at a point where we've got aggregated demand. We've got drivers for businesses to move to safer alternatives. We do have some greener options on the market, but they're still not getting up there. So what are some of the barriers to those? This is an incredibly blurry slide, but I will refer you to the report. This is from Green Chemistry and Commerce Council's report in 2015, summarizing barriers and incentives to green chemistry adoption on the marketplace. Some of it I've referred to before as supply chain complexity, confusion in the marketplace, not an adequate demand signal, despite all the noise that we know we've made at NGOs that comes in as a little blip on the radar. And then there are just issues of competitiveness, like how do you do, if an entire sector has a problem, so for example, cleaning chemicals and preservatives, inadequate preservatives, how do you get beyond some of the pre-competitive issues to find a solution that works for all of them? And with that, all right, so we've talked about drivers, various efforts that are happening at the industry level, the practice of selecting safer alternatives, and then the challenges of getting greener chemicals on the market. And with that, I'll hand it off to Tim and Meg.